distinguished guests, members of the Queen Mary community, friends, and 350 participants. May I extend to you the warmest welcome to a rather special event, Socially Distanced Diplomacy, the Diplomat in the Age of COVID, which I am delighted to open on behalf of the Queen Mary Global Policy Institute, whose advisory board members, fellows and associates are with us tonight across multiple time zones. The Institute, established in 2019, brings together all the many disciplines of the Queen Mary University of London University and focuses on three core themes for international engagement and impact: rights, inclusion and diversity, resilience and sustainability, health, recovery and reform. Diversity and inclusion lie at the heart of Queen Mary. Our research is for the greater good. We are still firmly in the age of contagion, and not simply in the form of the pandemic. With so much disruption in health, security, finance and the economy, the art, could one also say the science of diplomacy has never been more important. I'm therefore quite delighted to welcome all our discussants this evening, and I'm very pleased indeed to make way for your chair, John Benjamin, previously ambassador in Chile and Ghana, as well as consul general in New York. He is now ambassador designate to Mexico. John.
Thank you very much, Colin. Huge thanks to you for inviting us. And I'd like to also mention a former colleague of ours at the Foreign Office, Martin Uden, previously ambassador to the Republic of Korea, who now has an association with Queen Mary's and who first floated this idea some time ago. So thank you, Martin. Just to say to all of those listening in, it's a great pleasure to be with you. We have until 7:15 and we hope to leave the last half hour or so for questions and answers. So please, we're keen to hear your questions. Please use the Zoom Q&A facility, which you see at the top of your screen, and colleagues at Queen Mary's will have a look at those questions as they're coming in, and we'll pass those through to me later on for the final part of our discussion. So first of all, it falls to me to introduce two fantastic colleagues of mine from the Foreign Office. I'd like to start with Joanna Roper. Good evening, Joanna. Joanna is speaking to us from The Hague, where she is a British ambassador to the Netherlands, but interestingly, and quite rarely in our system, has another job as well. She's also permanent representative to the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, which aims to do what it says on the tin, but has had a much higher profile in the UK these last 2 or 3 years since the events in Salisbury. And as you'll hear in the first round of questions with Joanna in a few minutes, she also moved from London, where she had a huge role in the COVID-19 operation at its height, just under a year ago, where one of her big tasks, drawing on a previous experience as Director of Consular Affairs, was to mastermind a difficult operation to bring home, I think, some 15 to 20,000 Brits who were stuck on cruise ships around the world, and to seek a safe harbor for those boats and then bring the Brits back, which was not an easy task at all. And we'll talk a little bit about that. Joanna has also been previously the UK Special Envoy for Gender Equality. She's was Director for Consular Services. Very important, because that is the prime reason why an average Brit would ever come into contact with us, because of a consular issue overseas, and has served previously in Beijing and Tokyo and Islamabad, as well as being a former head of the China department and the headquarters in London. So a vastly experienced colleague. My other colleague, Simon Manley, has, as I mentioned, been the mastermind of the overall COVID-19 global operation through most of 2020. And we'll talk about that a little later, because it involved a huge and sudden reorganization and re-engineering of almost the whole organization. And as if that were not enough, at the end of the year, when everyone else was relaxing over Christmas, Simon was intimately involved in the part of the EU and post-Brexit negotiations to do with Gibraltar, which didn't come to fruition until unfeasibly late on New Year's Eve, I seem to recall. Before that, Simon was ambassador in Spain for nearly 6 years. He's been Director of Europe in the past, Director of Defence, Head of the Counterterrorism Policy Department, and he is off later this year to be our permanent representative to the UN organisations in Geneva. So Simon also brings huge experience. And I have a list of questions to get through with them shortly, which again, Colin, thank you to you and colleagues at Queen Mary's for putting them, suggesting them to us. So Colin, in his cover sheet for this event, described diplomacy as I quote, an often misunderstood profession. So I think it's incumbent on me and Joanna and Simon tonight to try and demystify it in the specific context of also of how it's changed over the last year. A reminder at the outset, though, of what diplomacy is. Basically, diplomacy is how countries conduct foreign policy. And their foreign policy is how a sovereign state has a strategy for dealing with other sovereign states, with the individually and collectively in the international community in order to safeguard its own interests and pursue its international goals, often in concert with others. So in its essence, diplomacy has an awful lot to do with trying to influence others' behavior, trying to persuade them to accept your preferred policy position, and also trying to influence public opinion, both at home and abroad. So in those terms, the debate tonight is very pertinent because COVID-19 and how we've had to work in a pandemic has affected that very deeply. I want to say at the outset, though, in the context of Colin's assertion that diplomacy is often a misunderstood profession, that before we talk with Joanna and Simon about the differences, I should say that many of the challenges we've all faced, and our many colleagues, and we have about 17,000 colleagues in the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, spread around the world in about 280 diplomatic posts. That's embassies, high commissions, permanent representations to international organizations, consulates, and so on. And those 280 posts are in about 180 different countries. And the majority of our staff are not British diplomats. They're what we call country-based staff, who make up the majority, in most cases, of the employees of each of those posts. And collectively and individually, we faced exactly the same challenges that everybody else has in many respects. So well-being is an important concept for us because many of our colleagues are juggling with the same thing as everyone else. Homeschooling, for example, caring for elderly parents, dealing with illness themselves. And I sadly have to note that we, in the wider Foreign Office community, have lost several of our own colleagues over the last year. And of course, many colleagues around the world don't live in circumstances at home which are particularly favorable to working, and they may struggle with the space available to them, with internet connections and so on and so forth. On the other hand, of course, as many people welcome the opportunity to work from home. I think it's dawned on many of us that commuting, which was a normal and a part of everybody's life. However, we all only have 16 or 17 waking hours at our disposal a day. And I think many of us have woken up to the realization that if you spend or waste, depending on how you define it, 2 or 3 of those hours every day getting to and from work, well, our eyes have been open to the what you can do when you save that time and put it to other purposes. But there are lots of issues for us around working flexibly. And there are lots of implications I'm sure we'll come to about a return to work. So a lot of what I think we'll cover this evening will also be about what we look forward to going back to on the other hand, what we want to change, what we want to keep of what we've been forced to do differently over the last year. And as with so many other professions, that raises lots of questions. Do we need big headquarters? Do we need to travel as much to meet other people? Is it good enough to meet in the format that we're all meeting tonight? Which is a point I'll come back to a little bit later on. So with that as a kind of introduction, I'm going to go first to Joanna, who, as I mentioned earlier, has had the experience of moving into a current role right in the middle of this, in I think it was autumn of last year. So Joanna, here's a few points, and please feel free to take them in whichever direction you'd like. So I have some questions around broadly, what's it like being an ambassador in the age of COVID? What is different from what was normality for an ambassador before? How does that affect the nature of the job? And in fact, have some key elements remained the same? And then connected to that, given the description I gave of what diplomacy involves earlier, with an ambassador right at the head of that in terms of trying to get under the skin of the country they're in or the organization, really understand it, build up a network of contacts, and then try and influence through those contacts. How much has that changed, and how possible has it been when you're largely confined, like everybody else, to working from home? So thank you, and over to you, Joanna.
Great. Well, thank you very much, John, and good evening, everybody. And it's really, really good to be here. And you're right, John. I arrived about 4 months ago in The Hague, and basically have been in lockdown, as all of my colleagues at the embassy have been as well. So it's been a really interesting start to a posting, certainly not one that necessarily I might have originally planned for. But of course, everybody is in a similar situation. All my sort of contacts here are in the same situation. My colleagues at the embassy have been in working from home for the majority of the year. The Netherlands itself has been in sort of hard lockdown for some weeks, and we expect that to go on. So, you know, the point is that we have to adjust. And you know, when I arrived, you know, and sort of moved in to where I'm living here at the moment, I realised that it's a very, very underutilised residence, because one of the aspects that we have, of course, is, you know, how to host and get to know people. But I'll come on to that in just a moment. I think the big thing is that, you know, when you're trying to get out there, you're trying to establish yourself as the new head of mission. There are two big angles, I think. First of all, the external piece. How can I sort of really get to know people, as you've said, get to know people when you're sort of largely working from home. And most of my introductory chats, conversations have been just like this, online. And so although you can sort of introduce yourself and try and build a rapport, it doesn't at all, you know, you're not getting the sort of the personal connection. And likewise with my team and colleagues at the embassy as well. You know, we do, and I can say a little bit more about the internal aspect of this, but, you know, you're trying to get to know people. It's very difficult when people are working from home. I've probably met just a small proportion of my colleagues in person. There are many, many more that I have yet to meet in person. And again, how do you get to know your colleagues and your team when we're working remotely? I think the big piece is not just introducing yourself and getting to know people initially, but actually how do you take it to that next level? How do you really develop a good rapport, a good understanding of where people are and how you can sort of, you know, as you say, sort of influence and project. So you have to think creatively. Almost all of my meetings have been, it's a very strange time to be starting here. How have you found it? And actually that's not a bad opening. You can sort of build on that. And I know that if this is happening at the beginning of my tour, that I still have some years to sort of really develop those relationships into something that's fruitful and productive as well. So everybody is sort of in the same boat. You just sort of have to think a little bit differently. Just before I move on, because there's sort of more I can say about that, you know, the internal piece is really, really important. And you talked about well-being and making sure that our colleagues are okay. it's very difficult sometimes to be able to, for me to, to know how people are feeling. So we've put a very, very big premium through team leaders, through senior staff and beyond, to try and make sure that we are supporting people who are working from home, juggling all of those different responsibilities that you talked about, homeschooling, sort of family commitments as well. So I can say a bit more about that, but it's a really, really big and important part of who we are and what we do around the network too. I'll leave it there for now.
And Joanna, one follow-up before moving on. You find yourself in The Hague, which
Yes.
I've had the pleasure of visiting. Quite a small, compact, incredibly well run and managed city. So in normal times, as opposed to many other cities we might find ourselves in around the world and in London itself, it would be so much easier to move around, to meet people, to cover the ground. So perhaps, does that make the loss of the ability to do that feel even worse?
So, I mean, I do miss it. I do miss the fact that you can't sort of go out and chat to people. People have got into the habit really of sort of meeting up for walks and, being outside. At the moment, the local guidance is sort of one-on-one or one person per day into your house. And of course, this is a working residence, but you still have to sort of fit within those guidelines. So one-on-one is fine. So you have moments to sort of meet people in person, meet up for walks outside. But it's not the same as, meeting somebody for, a lunch or, cup of coffee or a drink or something, because you just don't have that facility. It will come, of course it will come, but at the moment you just have to think a little bit more consciously and conscientiously about how you're communicating and how you can sort of develop the relationships that you want.
And allied to that, and this is a question I'll come on to with Simon shortly, on the multilateral side.
Yeah.
In normal circumstances, I imagine you'd quite often be sitting behind the UK nameplate at the OPCW and doing a lot of business in the sidelines with delegates from so many other countries. Is any of that happening at all, or is that similarly entirely 100% down the line? So
the working groups all meet virtually. Again, we have very, very small group meetings in suitably large and distant sort of setups. So you can have those conversations, and there are necessarily sometimes where it's preferable to be talking in person rather than online, of course. But largely it's all done online. I think when we were looking at the sort of the big annual meeting last year, where we had to split it into two parts, going into the conference centre, where, as you say, ordinarily there would be lots of people sitting behind all of the named seats, all very distant, all masked, and sort of in person for just the voting or just the bits where you needed to be present. And actually it's something on a multilateral level that you need to be thinking through, because there aren't necessarily the sort of the terms of reference to be able to do some of those things in a multilateral stage, but we have to be thinking creatively about continuing that business too.
Thank you, Joanna. Being back with you shortly. Simon, I'm going to ask you also, with a view to your forthcoming job in a moment, about the multilateral aspects. But since the theme of this event this evening is largely around what has changed and how we've changed in COVID-19, can you give all of our colleagues listening in a flavour of the organised chaos that was last April, when you and I and Joanna and so many other colleagues were working together to try and reorganise the Foreign Office itself to deal with this extraordinary challenge, and what that felt like?
Well, thanks very much, John, and thank you to Professor Grant and everybody for inviting me to this panel this evening. It's a real privilege. So I was kind of called in to lead the Foreign Office's coronavirus response back in mid-March last year. And for those of you, think back to mid-March last year, I'd been sort of tangentially involved a little bit in the early stages of the crisis, kind of helping out some of our consular colleagues in the initial response to Wuhan and Tenerife, where we'd had a number of problems with people stuck in a hotel where there'd been an outbreak. But I think few of us, realised not just the scale but the pace at which the pandemic would hit us. And I think you look back to mid-March last year, and what really struck us, I suppose, most particularly, were two things that were kind of immediately hitting us. One was the sort of collapse of the global transport network. I started on that kind of Monday, the 16th of March, and almost every day a kind of another route sort of fell away. And the second was obviously the degree of demand that we had from the National Health Service, social care, and the rest for essential PPE, ventilators, and the rest. And on the first of those, on this sort of the people challenge, I mean, the first question which we had was just like, how many Brits did we think were overseas? And of course, we don't have a means of factually checking that. We knew how many people had been overseas in the month of March a couple of years previously, because we have quite good statistical records of that, but we didn't know how many we had, and we were desperately trying to work out how many we had. But we wanted them to get them home where they could, and where they chose not to sort of stay kind of on site. And that meant getting back to the UK hundreds of thousands of people. And on the second, on the NHS challenge, it was about trying to procure at pace and with surety thousands and if not hundreds of thousands, if not millions of items of PPE, and trying to establish a kind of global procurement network to do that. Both those things required us to work at a scale and an agility which we had never had to do before. And in particular, to deal with the kind of the repatriation of people. And the first thing we realised was that there was no possible way that the UK government could actually bring back a couple of 100,000 people. I mean, we had no idea whether we were dealing with a couple of 100,000, 500,000, but we knew that we couldn't do that ourselves. So the first thing we knew was that we needed to enable the commercial carriers to do that as far as possible. So the first thing to do was to try and keep those air routes open. And then the second, we realized that that was not going to be capable of bringing everybody back, was effectively to set up our own airline. And we had a little bit of experience of doing that, because a couple of British airlines and travel companies had gone under in the months and years previously, both Monarch and then Thomas Cook. But this was a totally different scale, and it was us. It was the Foreign and Commonwealth Office who were having to really establish our own kind of capacity to charter airlines. And so that required us to bring in staff to do this at a level we'd never had to do in a crisis before. Both, Joanna and I had both done our share of Foreign Office crises at home and overseas, as you have, John, over the years. We'd never had to do this. We'd sort of brought in a few hundred, perhaps a couple of thousand people from crisis situations. At the end of this, we brought back kind of 60,000 plus people, including the people that Joanna was having to identify, cruise liners across the world, but also people who were stuck across the world. And you've read these extraordinary stories of people kind of riding horseback from the kind of the furthest outreaches of the kind of the Argentine pampas and right across India to get themselves to an airport. To do that required us to mobilize our network in ways we've never done before. So at peak, that meant us reassigning people, not just in the UK, but across our global network, to sustain what was a 24-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week operation. So at peak, we had 1,000 people reassigned to this task. And John, as you hinted, the most extraordinary thing about that was that on any given day, I reckon that we were no more than about 10 of us maximum who were actually physically in the office at any one time, physically in the Foreign Office. And so much of this was being done remotely. We were drawing people across the globe, because that gave us actually more of that 24/7 resilience. We were drawing people off other work, much of which of course had fallen away because of the crisis. And we were having to integrate the network in ways that we had never had to do before. We were enabled in that, frankly, by some very propitious investment in our IT in the months and years leading up to this that enabled us to do this in ways, to be honest, that I don't think all foreign ministers were able to do. So we were lucky because of that. People responded magnificently right across the network. People's commitment was extraordinary, because they were facing the same challenges, John, that you've identified that every other member of British society was facing, but they were often doing it overseas, and they're still doing it overseas. We've got thousands of our staff overseas who are often still separated from their loved ones back at home, haven't seen them for months. They've got kids who are in education or university here. They've got elderly parents perhaps are here. So really difficult personal circumstances, but really putting themselves on the line to enable people to get back to their loved ones in the UK. So it was an extraordinary operation, which I think for us showed us that we had an untapped agility and resilience across our network. We'll come on perhaps, John, to sort of kind of what does that mean for the future? But first of all, I think it was just the most extraordinary effort. And I should also just add something about the procurement network, particularly in Joanna's old China network, where they had to stand up a global procurement effort that was spending, at the end of the day, hundreds of millions of pounds to ensure that we had the ventilators that we needed in our hospitals, that our nurses and doctors across the NHS and into social care had the protective equipment that would keep them safe while dealing with COVID cases. Extraordinary times and an extraordinary response across the piece, which also had a policy element to it, of course, because we were also having to work up a kind of longer term policy response in terms of supporting the effort to secure equitable access to workable vaccines, therapeutics and diagnostics. And that's obviously an effort that continues to this day.
Simon, if I may, a little bit of reminiscing from me from that period before going on to the next question to you. I'm very struck that as late as the second week of March last year, it was pretty much a normal week for us in the Diplomatic Academy. The week unfolded as pretty much as it was previously planned to do. And by the following week, we'd shut it down pretty much. I don't know if we ruined your Dutch language training at the time, Joanna, but we suddenly pulled all of our colleagues who were in the middle of language training for a posting away from that and put them at your disposal, Simon, of your new operation there, trying to create it from nothing. And by a week after that, I was running a repatriation effort from Peru, which you might recall, which was pretty much the last thing we did en masse with everyone in the office. And we realized that we were putting everyone at risk because there were maybe 30 or 40 of us. There were shifts 24 hours a day, working in close proximity as the government advice began to change towards the first lockdown. And I wanted to second something you said, where I was very pleasantly surprised around our IT, because I had big worries that it would fall down because we never had so many people operating on our IT network at once. And I must say that year on, and I hope I'm not jinxing tonight, but when I have had the occasional IT problem since then, it's been far more due to my commercial internet provider at home than to the Foreign Office infrastructure. And that just shows the wisdom and the foresight of a decision in the middle of austerity a few years ago to invest millions in a new IT system, without which we couldn't have done this. And by the end of the Peru repatriation operation, when I and all of my colleagues involved in it were working at home, what really struck me was the last flight we organized. I was in a team where everyone else in the team were in Oslo, they were in Osaka, they were in Seattle. Didn't really matter where, everyone working unsocial hours in their various locations, but it felt seamless and it felt like as almost as if we were physically working in the same building. And all that happened in just 2 or 3 weeks of time. Simon, a follow-up to that, which bridges both that experience and into your forthcoming role. While you were running the COVID-19 operation through most of last year, we had a couple of summits, the Gavi summit, COVAX summits around international cooperation, working towards a vaccine, so on and so forth. How was that possible and how did that feel, trying to do all of that, including heads of state and heads of government meeting, bearing in mind not only your job coming up, but during the rest of 2021, Britain will have a G7 summit in Cornwall. And of course, come November, we have the COP26 summit, which in normal times, based on previous COPs, would have literally tens of thousands of people flying in to meet in various fora. So how does that all feel different to you now?
So John, look, I mean, you're right to flag it up. It feels remarkably different, right? Obvious first point. I've kind of, first posting was in New York. I've seen kind of Ministerial Week in New York, which is sort of a similar thing. And obviously it was Ministerial Week in New York last year, was very different. We ran a vaccine summit event on the 30th of September, completely virtually. And look, there's clearly something that you miss from that human interaction. You know, we are social beings, and that's a kind of broader point that runs through this, that diplomacy is a social piece of social behavior. So it's about social interaction above all else. So it is hard, and you do lose something. But there are also things that you are able to do, and in different ways when you do it virtually. I think in some ways it may even be easier, dare I say this, to bring together so many senior people in one place when it's done virtually. When you can also use an element of pre-record, for example. So a lot of these summit occasions now, you've got different people making speeches. Some of them are making it live. Some of them are doing it pre-record. You bring people in from very different walks of life as well. I mean, one of the things that I found really refreshing about our vaccine summit last September was that we were bringing together not just heads of government, and we were delighted to have Chancellor Merkel and Prime Minister Trudeau there, but we also had Bill Gates, and we had the Secretary General of the UN, and the head of the WHO, and we had the head of Johnson & Johnson talking about the contribution that the pharma companies are making to this vaccine effort. We have people from civil society talking about the importance of the civil society contribution. So in some ways, I think we were actually able to have a more inclusive event than we might have been able to do otherwise. And of course, that's perhaps not so surprising, because I think one of the things that all of us have seen, whether in the private or public sector, is that remote working can give you opportunities to be more inclusive about the ways that you work. And Joanna's absolutely right. Of course, when you do that at a level of kind of leadership, you've also got to be thinking more acutely than we ever had to do before about mental health and about the well-being of our staff, those who we lead. And we have a real responsibility there. But I do think there are things that we have been able to do differently, and as you said, John, at the beginning, in ways that perhaps have a lower carbon footprint, that we may want to kind of manage for the future. And also looking at how you do events in a hybrid fashion as well. How do you mix the physical and the virtual? Look, in ways that we're all doing in our private lives, aren't we? I mean, we're all we're engaging perhaps with the family with whom we live, but also with the family with whom we don't live.
Simon, thank you. I have another set of questions which bridge nicely into a couple of themes coming through in the first question. So feel free to answer more questions, ask more questions using the Q&A function, and our colleagues at Queen Mary are summarising them for us. So, Joanna, the next set of questions, and I'll put them both to you and Simon, are around, quite general, around what is it in old style pre-COVID diplomacy that had been challenging, even unappealing, which now look in a slightly different light, or conversely, what do you miss most? And that leads on to my first question coming in from our participant joining us tonight, who asks, let me read this to you. Do you think diplomacy will simply, quote unquote, go back to normal if and when we bring COVID-19 fully under control, or have certain things changed for good? And is that good or bad? So quite a general area, but your thoughts, Joanna, and then I'll come to Simon.
Great, thank you very much indeed. There are several things there. I think I'll take the second sort of set of questions first, really, because it links quite nicely to what Simon was just saying. And it's sort of, this question of normality. And there's sort of, we have recognised, because we have had to, that, most of our work is now being done remotely in different ways from different bits of our network. And actually, in many ways, the Foreign Office has been more used to sort of bringing people in from overseas and making sure we have those hybrid meetings, for example. But, we're doing this on a whole different scale. But there are advantages to that, whether it's getting those senior names to the big conferences and the big summits. And actually, the Dutch hosted the Climate Adaptation Summit very recently and did exactly that, and got some very, very good big names as part of their work on climate change. So these are some sorts of things that we can, sort of continue continue to hold on to that we are still achieving what we want to, but in a slightly different way. I think also the point about flexible and remote working is a really important one, and it's something that the FCDO has been thinking about for some time now, which is it's sort of linked to, you know, keeping families together. How do you keep dual careers going, for example, and actually recognizing that you can work from a different point of the network, a different bit of the world, and still achieve your job. Actually, you know, that's a good thing because it helps us move on. And as you said just a moment ago, John, I was our envoy for gender equality, and I was doing most of that work based out of Islamabad, but nobody really knew, apart from when they got emails from me at really quite odd, you know, times of the day and night, that I was sitting in Islamabad, where my husband was the High Commissioner, commuting back to London, and seeing my team and doing that sort of engagement. So that sort of hybrid role, but fundamentally that we are working in different ways now. And I think keeping hold of what works for us, both personally and institutionally, is something that we can really look to as we come out of these difficult times. In terms of, you know, how it's being done differently, you know, as I said, sort of many things are being done online. I've already had a couple of national days here, for example, where ordinarily you'd all be gathering in, you know, the ambassador's residence and chatting and mixing and all of that sort of thing. You can't do that anymore. Now, you know, sort of a 2-minute slot from an ambassador sort of welcoming and making the marking the moment isn't quite the same. But, you know, again, I think we'll probably shift back to the old ways of working because, as Simon says, we are inherently social people. That's why we are here, and we want to be sociable with our colleagues. But it's interesting that this is, I think, caused us all to think quite, you know, carefully and deliberately about how we do our job, and what it is that we can keep with us as we move out of this phase into the future.
And Joanna, a related point, before we come back to Simon on the same set of issues, any thoughts on the future of, well, basically big buildings? Do we need big headquarters? Do we need big embassy buildings in the long run? Will we just go back to workings before? Because when we're able to, it may still perfectly suit and be perfectly feasible for many of our employees and colleagues to work from home quite a lot of the time. So what do you think the impact of that will be?
So I don't think we'll see any you know, immediate change, because fundamentally the embassy is more than it is more than just where people sit to do work. It is, you know, where we welcome people. It's where we have our, you know, sort of interaction. And as much as working online, you know, is functional, it doesn't quite replace, as we've said before, it doesn't replace that personal, you know, face-to-face contact, which is just so important. So I think it's how we do it and not necessarily where we do it that will cause us to think through.
But perhaps at your embassy and elsewhere, is it quite feasible that in future many colleagues might typically work 2 or 3 days a week physically in the office, 2 or 3 days a week at home as a regular normal working pattern? Is that conceivable?
And that's perfectly fine. You know, that's one of those things, those benefits of if actually that helps us work effectively. And certainly, I think probably to begin with, we will end up having to think quite carefully about the embassy office setup and how we can bring people together without sort of exposing them or making them, you know, sort of vulnerable, you know, even when we've all had vaccines and what have you. So I think it's an ongoing sort of, you know, let's see what works, but keeping that flexibility, you know, has got to be a good thing as well.
Thank you, John. Simon, a little example, if I may, before inviting you to kind of riff off that same set of issues about looking back and what innovations you'd like to keep. In my previous job as director of the Diplomatic Academy, in a normal year, the equivalents from about 75, 80 ministries of foreign affairs around the world meet. And last year it was going to be in Bahrain. It didn't happen, obviously, in that format. And so our colleagues in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Bahrain ran the event in this format, as you'd expect. And an interesting discussion evolved from that, because whereas pretty much everyone agreed that had we met in person, it probably would have been a better and more productive meeting, as well as all the informal connections that are made and the ideas that come out of that. Nevertheless, the way we did it online, much as with many of the summits you were involved with last year, was good enough and fulfilled the basic requirement. And from that, another question arose, which is, considering all the expense and the time, very valuable finite resource, all the carbon footprint, everything else that would have gone into 70 or 80 of us traveling to Bahrain for 3 or 4 days, has the bar risen against in-person meetings of that kind in future because it's good enough doing it in this format? Over to you for some thoughts on that, Simon.
So I'll come to that in a second, John, just to pick up on one of Joanna's points about the sort of diversity aspect of this. So I think it is important. It's important in all organisations, yeah, but I think it's particularly important for us in the diplomatic service that seeks not just to represent and advance the interests of the British people, but also to look and feel like the British people in its rich diversity. And you know, some of the most heartwarming kind of things that I heard during my leadership of the COVID response were from those members of staff who've been drawn in, often from other bits of government, to our response, who said to me, "Yeah, this has been great because being able to work remotely from home has enabled me to come and work for the Foreign Office in a way that I never thought I'd be able to do previously." So we were able to be actually more of a Department of State as well as for the whole United Kingdom in ways that we hadn't been hitherto. And I think we have tried to take that as way as we've looked to sort of our geographical footprint in the UK and the way that we're going to be working in future. So, I mean, on the sort of the question, yes, I think the bar has probably been raised, John. I mean, and the answer to your question, yeah, will diplomacy go back to normal? I mean, I don't think it will go back to the old normal. And I think, you know, to be honest, the particular challenge for us all of climate change, which is obviously so vital to us this year as we prepare for COP26, I think it forces all of us to ask ourselves, you know, is this bit of air travel or even cruise ship travel, Joanna, really necessary? Can you do this remotely? And that, you know, same is going to be true for us in terms of holidays and the rest of it, isn't it? But I think that is a question that we're going to have to ask ourselves, as people will be asking themselves right across the public sector and in the private sector as well. And I think you know, kind of relating also to your question about sort of buildings with Joanna, I mean, it forces us to ask ourselves the kind of essential question of, yeah, what are we there for? What is it that we add? You know, what does the presence of a diplomat in The Hague or in Mexico City or in Geneva add to that job being done by somebody in London, in Manchester, in Belfast or Edinburgh? And I always said to my team when I was ambassador in Madrid that I didn't want to see them sat in the embassy behind a computer screen all day, because somebody could do that back in the UK. You know, there was a reason that we spent all that money sending particularly UK-based members of staff. I know, obviously, you know, as you say, John, a lot of our staff are recruited locally as country-based staff, but you know, we do send abroad a lot of people, and it costs money. You have to find accommodation for them. You train them in languages, and you do that, in my view, primarily because you want them out on the streets of that country, engaging with the politicians, the investors, the civil society representatives, not just to report on what's happening in that country. My other big point to people, you're not just there to kind of tell London what's happening, because they can probably also get that from other sources. You're there to make a difference. You're there to influence. So that does mean engaging with people. And yes, you can do some of this virtually, just as we do in all our other interactions. You know, we are no longer purely analog beings. We're all part analog and part digital in the way we interact with friends and family and the rest. The same is true of diplomacy, but you know, there is a really important analog aspect to it, which means getting out, meeting people, engaging with them, creating human bonds with people. And we've just got to be, I think, be really clear in our own minds about that distinct added value about the presence of our people across the world and how they create the relationships that deliver for the UK over the long term.
Simon, thanks very much for that. And bridging into a couple of other questions, again, first for Joanna and then back to Simon. One has come in from, I think we touched on it at the beginning of our conversation, it's coming from Alex, a Queen Mary graduate. And his question, or her, I'm not sure I don't have more details about Alex, but Alex asks, how has the negative impact been of home working in your ability to understand what is going on out there? How can you best mitigate any of the shortcomings by not being able to do all the things that Simon has just described as at the heart of diplomacy? And another question for both of you, but starting with Joanna, around public diplomacy. How has public diplomacy changed in terms of, because that is a means of communication that is still open to us, perhaps has been, it has certain advantages when we're limited to communicating in this way. So any thoughts and any early experiences you have there in The Hague of that too? Over to you, Joanna.
Thanks, John. I mean, I will absolutely echo what Simon just said about, you know, sort of the interpersonal, the sort of making a difference and getting out from your desk. And that is where we started this conversation, because, you know, it has been a challenge, and it is a challenge to do that under the circumstances here. So I think, you know, making best use of the tools that we have available, whether it's IT or, you know, the sort of, you know, phone calls or public diplomacy, you know, is really, really important. And I think for me, it's not just, you know, meeting people for the first time, it's how do you get beyond that first intro call into developing those relationships where you can get under the skin and you can understand a little bit more. And I think, you know, there's a role for the head of mission. There's also a role for the team as well. And again, they're slightly more constrained as well, but sort of using your eyes and ears and other contacts, I think, you know, you have to use, as you know, as I say, sort of everything that you have available to you. And how do you mitigate it? I think just by using the public diplomacy, using the tools available to you, and just being a little bit more active in keeping those contacts going. You know, if we're all you know, on Twitter and Facebook and what have you, then maybe there's a greater channel to be able to use that. But they're very small, short sound bites very often. So again, it's how do you sort of take it to the next level? And you know, I have a great team here who's thinking very, very creatively about all of that at the moment, particularly as we look ahead, not just post-COVID, but post, you know, EU exit, and sort of what do we want to do sort of to craft the UK, the millions and you know, really deep, strong bonds between the UK and the Netherlands. So we will all talk about that, but really it's sort of looking up and over into the future and trying to craft something that my team can look ahead to. As I say, using public diplomacy, using all of those tools available to us. Fundamentally, I'll be, you know, just as we've said, really, really pleased when I can get out and about and meet people and really develop those relationships at the next level.
Thank you, Joan. And Simon, your thoughts on that same kind of nexus of issues?
So just on the public diplomacy, I mean, I agree with everything Joanna said, so I won't kind of try and add or subtract from that. But just on the public diplomacy piece, I mean, I think, again, you know, the experience of COVID threw us into sharp relief, because, you know, our heads of mission across the world, you know, we're having to rely, particularly on sort of digital media, finding themselves in a position of having to be the people kind of out there explaining to Brits in their countries. And John, you know, you saw that in Peru, and Joanna saw it in cruise ships across the world, but they're having to explain to kind of Brits who are stranded across the globe kind of what they needed to do. And so our ability to kind of, you know, to explain clearly and in a engaging and human way was really tested. And, you know, I think so one of the things I took away from that was, you know, we sometimes congratulated ourselves that we had become much more kind of good digital diplomats. And John, you were a pioneer on that. For any of the 300 odd people listening, you know, do look at John's amazing Twitter feed over the years. You'll learn a lot about British diplomacy and quite a lot about West Ham United's travails over the years. But, you know, we really had to up our game. And you know, so some of this isn't new, of course. You know, we've been living with this sort of digital transformation of our public diplomacy for some time, and its ability to scale up, its ability to give us reach. But you know, this whole crisis has taken us another step forward on this, and it's never, of course, you know, in of itself, does not suffice. I think that's Joanna's point. You know, it has to be part of a clearly integrated strategy about influencing and informing. But I think we have seen how we can do some of these things, how we can have effect, how we can create influence by digital means when, you know, physical diplomacy has not been available to us. And I think that's really exciting, and trying to understand how we make the most of the technology, how we make the most of our expertise and experience to deliver those effects is, it's one of the big challenges for all of us, I think.
So on public diplomacy, and Joanna, I'm sure you experienced this in the cruise repatriation operation. What really struck me was we got the vast majority, 90-something% of the Brits who were stranded in Peru out, but those who were left behind for whatever reason that we couldn't get to them in time, or they themselves got COVID and weren't allowed to leave, and their unhappiness and their dissatisfaction often took over the news cycle rather than the general achievements. I was very, very struck by that. I think I've told Simon this before, but I had a wonderful email about 6 months later, so something like September last year, from one of the Brits that we repatriated from Peru, who I'd been in contact with over social media, through Twitter, in fact. And he asked me if, when COVID-19 was finally over, we'd pay to fly him back out to Peru to resume the trekking holiday that we so rudely interrupted with the invitation to get on a BA charter flight back home. So some of these stories have quite a long tail. We have a few more questions coming in, and again, I'll go to Joanna first, and then to Simon. What advice would you offer someone considering a career in the British diplomatic service in 2021 and beyond? And you're on mute.
Yeah. No, I was pausing for time to think. I mean, I think the first thing to say is I think it's one of the best career options, the best professions to be in. I started my career in the Home Office. I worked for and came into the Foreign Office about 20 odd years ago. As you said at the beginning, John, I've worked in Japan, in China, two times, a couple of times in Pakistan and London, and done a whole range of things. And I think, if it's public service that motivates you, and if it's being able to really represent your government, your country overseas, as well as having all of those really interesting, challenging, stimulating positions, roles of, as we've talked about, influencing, learning a language, getting really under the skin of different countries, and recognizing that you are part of a machine that is making, or an architecture that is really making a difference literally on a sort of a global scale. Not to overstate it too much, but it is something that is, it's a fantastic job. And so if you are really interested, this is a very specific, piece of advice, then keep your eye open on civil service jobs, because, we do keep recruiting, but it is, it's just one of those, you can see the way I'm sort of talking about this, that it is just one of those fantastic professions to be in. And it's a great privilege to be serving my country in the way that I am.
Right, very uplifting. I second everything you said. Anything to add on that one, Simon?
She spoke better than I could on that one. It's a great career.
I totally support that. Just to say, for those listening in who asked those questions, I have a couple more in a second, somewhat related to that. In my previous job, part of our role was to bring on board new recruits, including the graduate intake. And last year we had 42 people join us, which is higher than the average, looking back over the last few decades. And it's still a very popular career, because those 42 people emerged from over 30,000 applicants to the first stage of the civil service exams process. But there were a number of challenges. I think, Simon, when you set up the COVID operation, when Joanna was running the cruise repatriation operation, all the other parts of it, we trying to turn the super tanker around of a giant organization, but we proved to be pretty agile. So it's an answer to one question's come in of what are some of the essential skills and agility and the ability to deal with crises and not be fazed by having to completely reorganize what you thought you were going to do for a given day, week, month, whatever it might be. That's definitely a skill that's required. But one of the challenges has been that when Simon and Joanna set up those operations, many of those involved already knew each other quite well. We know maybe in many circumstances work together. Previously, we'd known each other for many years, so there was a bit of a kind of social and professional hinterland, which helped create a bit of esprit de corps, I think. With the new entrance of last year, a really difficult challenge, which again, I think is generic for all organizations, was how to help people feel they really belonged and get off to a good start, when in many cases, even now, several months on, they haven't actually physically met any of the people they work with, and they haven't met each other, with all that comes from that, from lunches and going out for a drink after work and building social relations. None of that is available at the moment. And I think that's quite a challenge, where we can also learn lessons from how other organizations are doing that. So back a couple of, because time is moving on, we've got about a quarter of an hour, so I'm just going to throw out a few questions and invite Joanna and Simon to this time not to be nailed down by a very particular one that I choose, but to riff off whichever sounds most appealing to them. So perhaps Simon, for one more to you, from our colleague and friend, former colleague Martin Uden. Of course, COVID-19, consular work, PPE, everything you described was our overwhelming priority in 2020. But how are those priorities changing in 2021 beyond COVID, as we hopefully move through the pandemic? And Joanna, there's on well-being, which we've touched on. There's a question here about what management techniques have you used to help keep FCDO colleagues going, from all their diverse backgrounds, different nationalities, many of whom are physically and mentally exhausted and stressed out, some of whom are just bored by sitting at home and not having a social life as we used to know it. What are some of the welfare techniques? So let me throw out a couple more if you don't mind, Joanne and Simon, then you can riff off whichever ones you'd like to. Are there any particular implications of socially distanced diplomacy for our network of free trade negotiations going on at the moment, which is of course one of the biggest outward expressions for us of our post-Brexit situation? And let me give you a couple more. Simon, you alluded to the challenges before of just understanding how many Brits we had, since we don't make Brits register when they're abroad, either as residents or visitors. Is there anything we can do better in future for that data gathering process, while respecting people's freedom to register or not as they choose? So Joanna first, just choose whichever one of those appeals to you most.
Okay, thank you very much for great questions there from you, John, via the listening audience. So I will take the well-being and the looking after your staff piece, because I think it is really, really important, and we've all spoken about it, and we all recognise that these are really big challenges that are facing us as friends, colleagues, leaders, wherever we are based in the network and around. And I think one of the things that, particularly during the COVID work that we were doing in London, when I was doing it back in London, and after having done the cruise bit, I went into sort of back up our consular operation as a former consular director. And ordinarily, you would have people together helping British citizens, their families, through some really, really difficult circumstances, but they would all be sitting together and able to support themselves and just, either just let off steam, or just give encouraging words, or just have a bit of sympathy, or whatever it might be. And then we had to recognise under COVID that everybody was at home, as you said earlier, under very, very difficult circumstances. We heard of people, not wanting to be able to sort of operate because they're in a shared house, or they're using their ironing board for a desk, or they're in, sort of sitting in their shared house in their bedroom. It was very, very difficult. And that for us was a really, really, big moment. How do we make sure that we are looking after all of our colleagues when we are also detached from each other? Coming here, as I said earlier, not having met the majority of my staff, my colleagues in person, my teams are sort of all sort of disparate. What is it that I can do? And I think it's very much about, consciously and conscientiously reaching out, making sure we've got enough communication that's sort of going up and down and out and around, and sort of really trying to check in and make sure people have the opportunity to talk, within their teams, their line managers, to talk outside. We have a big sort of well-being effort in the embassy, encouraging people to take time out during the working day, for example, to go for a run or look after their children, or to say it's okay if you need to balance with your homeschooling, because that takes some of the pressure away. So there's that whole sort of empathetic sort of metaphorical support that we can put around people, making sure they feel very, very supported in what are very difficult times. I think the other thing certainly that we've seen here is towards the end of the year, looking at some of the travel restrictions, all of our flights that were banned between the UK and elsewhere. It was difficult for people to travel to see their families. There was an immediacy amongst a sort of a core team, a rotating core team over weekends, late into the night, on travel advice, making sure we were communicating to the British public living here about changes. So making sure that they also had the support when they were working really, really hard, just acknowledging that was a big part of what we tried to do. But at the same time, while you're looking at the immediate, was trying to paint this picture and this vision of what it would be like in time when that day comes, when we're able to work together and work on something that we can all buy into and have talked about and engaged on. And that's the sort of the future relationship. So there's something about dealing with the immediate, as well as painting something I hoped that would be optimistic for colleagues around the embassy. And then there's some very sort of practical things, having one-to-one cups of coffee, going for a walk around lunchtime, sort of making sure that I was available to talk as much as anybody else, if, sort of trying to balance and being accessible and all of those sorts of things, just visibly signalling that it's important to me, as well as sort of the rest of the team around. I just wanted to also, because I think there is something else that we probably could have just touched on when we were talking about the recruitment to the Foreign Office. I just really, really wanted to reassure people that we are looking to recruit, from all kinds of backgrounds. You talked about it as well when you were doing your outreach too, John, but really encouraging anybody who wants to join the organisation. The diversity, you don't have to have gone to a particular school or university. Really, if it's something that appeals to you, then please do get in touch. It makes us who we are. If we are representing the UK, we need to be properly representative of the UK within our organisation. So I just wanted to sort of pick that point up as well. And I might hand over to Simon while I think about some other answers too.
Okay, so Simon, over to you, and then we're going to, as we've only got 10 minutes, slightly rapid fire, and I've got one more question for each of you after that. So Simon, over to you.
So first of all, couldn't agree more with Joanna on diversity and the organisation that we want to create, the service we want to create of and for and by the entire United Kingdom. On the questions, picking up Martin's question. Hi, Martin. Thank you very much for thinking of this initiative in the first place. This is a really exciting year to be a diplomat of and for the UK, because it's not often that you kind of get to be hosting the most important climate change conference in a generation, and chairing the G7, and this month also presiding over the UN Security Council. So we have one of those moments that kind of comes by every so often in international diplomacy, when you have a real platform to pursue our objectives, and we have a really big responsibility there to make a success of Glasgow. This is a make or break moment for the world. It's kind of, that's easy to say, but we really mean it. If we don't succeed in Glasgow this year in turning the tide on climate change, our children and grandchildren will live to regret our failure. Second, we have to, and pursuant to that, we have to make a success of our response to COVID, and to build back better, which means in a greener, more sustainable fashion. And we've got a real responsibility for that. But first of all, we've got to make a success of the response to COVID, at the heart of which lies, as we've all seen in recent days, the battle to ensure that we have safe and secure vaccines available to all. And we are playing an absolutely vital part in that through our £1 billion contribution to the COVAX facility and the rest. And we have to support that through genuinely free and fair trade. including pharmaceutical products, vaccines, and the rest. So this is, we've got a really big agenda this year. It's really exciting to be a part of that. And, personally, I'm delighted that a lot of it's going to be happening in Geneva.
Thank you, Simon. So feel free to pick up any more of that. So I've got, as we move into the last few minutes, a question for each. And Joanna, this is a question from Fatima. Thank you, Fatima, for sending this one in. Straying into the area of human psychology, this one, but interesting one. In both dealing with bilaterally with the Dutch government and of course with many, the representatives of many countries at the OPCW, Fatima's question is it harder now online to raise sensitive issues with host governments? Because Fatima suggests surely something is lost without all the non-verbal clues and body language that goes into a face-to-face discussion. And Simon, for a question from Nyan. Evening, Nyan. Question is, how do you keep morale high in the face of criticism of us, of our own government, for our own COVID-19 response? And I remember that was a feature even quite early on. You mentioned how hard everyone was working from scratch, really, to source and import PPE from all over the world. But when it was perceived to go badly wrong, as it did over a weekend in Turkey, for example, that for a while became the main news of the day and can become a bit of a demotivating factor. So Joanna first and then Simon.
Great, thank you, John, and thank you, Fatima, for that question. You're absolutely right. I mean, there are some occasions where you do just need to get into the same room as somebody and have those conversations, and you can do that. By default, we all have to work from home, but by necessity, sometimes we do need to get to know each other a little bit more, particularly for those sort of more sensitive conversations. And so we can still do that. I think for me, sort of leading the embassy, I want to make sure that I'm sending the right messages for people to feel able to work from home. But I think everybody recognises that there are moments, as I say, where we do have to get together, whether it's for difficult, sensitive conversations or even just the occasional cup of coffee in person, which is always nice.
Thank you, Joanna. And Simon, on the morale point.
Well, I think, John, I think it's a really good question from you, and it's a tough one as well. This is the country that I love and I have chosen to serve. So when we get criticised, and whether it be for the nature of our response to COVID or for anything else, it hurts me. And I think it hurts all of us who have chosen to serve our country in this way. But we kind of, I think one of the great things that we have as a kind of service is extraordinary resilience, a pride in the country and the people that we serve. And we pick ourselves up. And we focus on the positives, and so I'm really proud to see a country today, and kind of inspired by the marvellous example of Captain Sir Tom Moore, who so sadly passed away today. That spirit of service, the fact that we've got 9 million people vaccinated in an extraordinary operation over the last few weeks, the fact that our scientists are playing an absolutely leading role in finding safe and secure vaccines, that we've been doing the genome tracing that is going to enable the world to tackle some of the variants that have arisen either here or elsewhere. That gives me great pride. So it's about kind of resilience in the bad moments, pride, and knowing how to celebrate success when you do indeed deliver for us, for the British people, and I hope for the global community.
Thank you very much, Simon. We have a couple of minutes left. I'm just going to acknowledge a comment from our Queen Mary colleagues to say there are a lot of questions and points coming in about careers with the FCDO. In general terms, the easiest thing to do is go to www.gov.uk, which is the overall umbrella website for the British government. Then look for the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. And I think as a link on the opening page, there is a page, I think it's called Working With Us, and that takes you to more information about all the different career routes that are open, including the open competitions through the civil service and how to apply for them. There's no hidden way in, there's no other way in if you happen to know somebody, which may be a feature of certain other foreign ministries around the world, but isn't with us. Every available route for getting into the office is fully explained there, including internships, diversity schemes that we have, fixed term contract opportunities that come up. So please have a look there. So in our final couple of minutes, I'll perhaps just ask Joanna, and I think we may have lost Simon. Is that right?
He's just lost connection, I think.
Okay, either that or his perhaps one of his children pulled the cable out to get him off to the parents' evening on time. Joanna, looking to the future, but being guardedly realistic and optimistic, how do you hope your life, your working life, looks by, say, at the latest Christmas of this year? What do you look forward to most?
So what do I look forward to professionally? I think it's meeting my colleagues in the embassy and getting, out and about and really understanding, my Dutch colleagues, my international colleagues as well, and getting to understand the country too. That's something that I've not been able to do as much as I would like to at all. So by Christmas, I think professionally having, really sort of got under the skin and really got to know people and got to know the country too. And I think actually for everybody, just that it's just a little bit, it's just easier. All of the things that we've talked about, all of those challenges, whether it's, juggling homeschooling or being separated from your family or not being able to travel, whatever it might be, just hang on to what's worked for us, but actually, really coming together as a team and as Simon and sort of representing your country in this way as we come through these really dark days is a real privilege and I feel hugely proud to be doing it too. So looking ahead with hope and optimism is what I would say.
All right, well, folks, everyone connected with Queen Mary, thank you very much for being with us this evening. I think we've tried to cover a lot of ground, but through our colleagues at QML, we're happy to take any other questions by email later on, or if you have any troubles tracking down the information I mentioned, we can steer you in the right direction. Thank you very much, Professor Colin Grant. Thank you to Martin Uden, to all the team at QML who set this up so wonderfully. Thank you for your questions. And we've lost Simon, but thank you to Simon, and thank you very much to Joanna over there in The Hague. And I hope we're able to do something similar again in ever more encouraging circumstances in the months to come. So thank you and good evening to everybody.
Thanks, John. Thanks to the team.